Review: Blood of an Exile.
Flawless Burchard is an exiled noble, banished for a heinous act, the massacre of Almiran rebels and their families. He is forced to become a Dragonslayer and to wander the realm facing these terrible and beautiful creatures in single combat until, eventually, one of them wins and kills him. Unfortunately, Burchard has proven far too successful at his work, and during his years of exile has racked up more than 60 kills. He is summoned back by the king and offered his old life back in exchange for the completion of an impossible mission. Failure means death, and refusal means death, so it's an opportunity he cannot turn down. Blood of an Exile is the first book in Brian Nasland's Dragons of Terror trilogy. The genre of gritty epic fantasy is a crowded one, with many writers vying for the reader's attention. Nasland appears to be aware of this, as Blood of an Exile starts fast, with a dramatic duel between Burchard and a dragon, before shifting to a second narrative and recounting the journey of a mysterious traveller, Garrett, as he arrives in the kingdom of Almira. Nasland's story is filled with the tropes of the genre, with a mixture of assassins, thieves, battles, heroes, dragons, and different forms of magic. There is an ecological theme to the writing as well, which is gradually revealed as being part of the plot. As with all things, there are certain simplifications made by Nasland and his characters, as he outlines the way in which the people of his fantasy world need to make difficult decisions, and occasionally oppose innovation and industry to preserve their environment. The real-world parallel is quite clear, although it is also somewhat ironic, given the way in which the same themes were explored when J.R.R. Tolkien described the idyllic countryside of the Shire, and set a template for writing traditional fantasy throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Nasland's take is not preachy, but his view, outlined through the proxy of his characters, is fairly clear, and this is likely to be a theme that is developed further in the rest of the trilogy. Blood of an Exile doesn't stray far from the main themes of the genre, and Nasland handles these with solid and competent writing. The tendency towards modern dialogue without embellishment is something he embraces, which can be an issue for some readers. Most of his characters are well thought out and established carefully, but they do not rise above those in other fantasy epics, although his 4 principal perspective cast are all interesting in their own way. The name Garrett, used for an assassin, does raise immediate comparisons to a popular video game franchise. Events are drawn together for the story's resolution. For the most part, this is handled well, although there is one character who manages to travel a very long way very quickly, in time to make a decisive contribution to the final battle of the book. The conclusion leaves enough loose ends for us to look forward to the next installment of the trilogy. Blood of an Exile is a fast-moving page-turner, full of the elements that genre fans will like. Contained within the story we have a quest involving a disparate band of individuals who, over time, become loyal to one another. We have a siege, we have political games, betrayal, assassinations, and more. In many ways, for traditional fantasy readers, this book is like an old friend you have never met. Blood of an Exile by Brian Nasland is published by Tor.
H.P. Lovecraft, 100 Years On.
A century after publication, the works of H.P. Lovecraft continue to influence popular media. His were tales that disturbed the mind and enthralled the senses. However, in his time, he was a virtual nobody. He is neither as influential nor as well known as literary Goliaths like J.R.R. Tolkien or his idol Edgar Allan Poe. Yet from his imagination was birthed an entirely new subgenre, the cosmic horror story. Lovecraft was fanatically loyal to his hometown of Providence, Rhode Island. He liked cats. He had a happy childhood and many friends by correspondence well into adulthood. He was an atheist, but adored the gods of ancient Egypt and Greece so much that he prayed to them as a boy. He was a complicated man and by no means an entirely positive figure. He was extremely anti-Semitic, so much so that his wife left him, and he expressed fondness for Adolf Hitler during his lifetime before he died in 1937. He was racist, even composing several stories in which the horror was interracial breeding. His of-the-time thinking included an obsession with lineage and nobility. A number of his stories included the notion that family bloodlines could suffer generational curses, and many promoted the themes of fear of difference and change. Nonetheless, Lovecraft's true legacy lies not in his narrow-mindedness, but in his ability to blow the mind entirely. He drew inspiration from night terrors and the state of consciousness between sleep and waking. He had many influences in his life that steered him towards the bizarre and horrific. His father's insanity and death due to syphilis, the works of Edgar Allan Poe, and humankind's recent, at the time, discoveries of the scale and complexity of the universe. Human understanding of the cosmos expanded at a breathtaking rate during his lifetime, but for all that these scientific discoveries increased our knowledge about the nature of reality, they invariably led to more questions than answers. Breaking from many science fiction writers and publishers of the time, Lovecraft rejected the modern notions of progress and technological advancement in his fiction. He was more comfortable with the weird, the way in which a story can destabilize the reader's experience by undermining the narrator's assumptions, something Poe did before him. Lovecraft's writings spoke to the nihilist notion that human beings are ignorant, insignificant specks adrift in the universe, no more able to understand the nature of reality than insects. Many today can identify with his philosophy of so-called cosmic indifference. Despite all this, Lovecraft was not so different from a typical nerd today. He was an amateur astronomer. He became interested in stories as a child, enthralled by the gothic horror tales his grandfather shared with him. He read ravenously, preferring books to people. His non-fiction work, supernatural horror and literature, references a vast array of fictional works, demonstrating his knowledge of the field at the time. Lovecraft chose to write in a thick British style, which was already considered out of date at that time. This was something he was inspired to do by Edgar Allan Poe, and, like Poe, he included various archaic forms of language in his work. He didn't think his own stories were particularly worth publishing, at least at first. Arguably, of all of Lovecraft's short stories, his most influential and well-known is The Call of Cthulhu. It is the only story he ever wrote centered about the eponymous Cthulhu, which would go on to be the focus of one of the greatest collections of modern folklore, the Cthulhu mythos. The story, originally published in the pulp magazine Weird Tales, is framed as a manuscript discovered after the death of a man named Francis Wayland Thurston. It contains 3 stories within a story, each describing escalating narratives throughout a fictional history, describing the worship and near escape of the long-lived eldritch abomination. Readers who have not read the story are encouraged to do so. It's a fascinating experience and a premier example of Lovecraft's work. A creature beyond human understanding, capable of impossible things, is discovered, possibly worshipped, and drives witnesses to utter madness. In the story, Cthulhu has been imprisoned for vigintillions of years, a vigintillion being 10 with 63 zeros after it. This sort of mind-bending detail is typical of Lovecraft. The story includes horrifying dreams and cults seeking to bring back ancient horrors, both of which have become common fantasy tropes. At the time, Lovecraft thought it was a middling story, and Weird Tales didn't want to publish it when he first submitted it. Since its publication, however, it has acquired incredible renown. In addition to being remade as films, comic books, and radio plays, in 2018 it was published as a video game. The Call of Cthulhu tabletop role-playing game released its 7th edition in 2014 and has been featured in popular shows such as Critical Role. During his life, Lovecraft was generous with his fictional world. He invited other writers to work within his mythos, labelled thereafter the Cthulhu mythos. The first group included Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, Robert Bloch, Frank Belknap Long, Henry Kuttner, and others, and this period of development was later called the First Stage. After Lovecraft's death due to cancer of the small intestine, the Cthulhu mythos was expanded further in the second stage, guided by his friend and publisher August Derleth, who first coined the term Elder Gods. Since Derleth, many writers of Lovecraftian horror have taken inspiration from the mythos. After some dispute between Derleth and R.H. Barlow, the writer Lovecraft left as executor of his work, copyright of his work is now public domain. Lovecraft wrote many other Cthulhu-themed stories that hint at the vast length mythology he had constructed. Most of his writings fit into this massive world narrative. Throughout his work, he managed to maintain the sense that we were glimpsing something huge and beyond comprehension. Dagon was an earlier piece, believed to be the very beginning of the Cthulhu mythos. Pickman's model is the tale of an artist who creates disturbing pieces, and independent filmmakers from many countries have turned the story into short films. At the Mountains of Madness is the nearest we get to an explanation of Lovecraft's fictional history. It is the journal of an explorer, one William Dyer, who journeys to Antarctica and discovers an ancient city beyond a huge mountain range. The explorers face horrid monsters and barely escape with their lives, The story would later inspire Dan O'Bannon to create the Alien franchise and John Carpenter to make The Thing. The Shadow Out of Time is another well-known story in which a monster steals a man's body for years at a time and has had some adaptations. The Shadow over Innsmouth tells the story of a man stranded in an isolated town and his efforts to escape as the cult-like inhabitants hunt him through the streets. Lovecraft's own favourite of his stories was The Colour Out of Space, centred around a poisonous meteorite that crashes into a Massachusetts farm. My personal favourite of Lovecraft's work is Cats and Dogs, a 6,000-word essay making the very important point that cats are superior to dogs. Lovecraft wrote, "Dogs, then, are peasants, and the pets of peasants. Cats are gentlemen, and the pets of gentlemen." The man certainly loved his cats. Other works included The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, Cool Air, once adapted into a comic called Baby It's Cold Inside, The Dreamland Stories, The Dreams in the Witch House, The Dulwich Horror, The Festival, From Beyond, a parody of Frankenstein eccentrically titled Herbert West, Reanimator, In the Walls of Eric's, Lovecraft's only science fiction pulp piece, The Music of Eric Zahn, The Nameless City, The Outsider, The Rats in the Walls, The Shunned House, an unusual parody called Sweet Ermengarde, The Temple, The Thing on the Doorstep, and The Whisperer in the Darkness. Many of these stories aren't horribly racist, and some are quite profound. His creations were used so freely, indeed with his urging, by a group of his contemporaries known as the Lovecraft Circle. Lovecraft's legacy lives on in the work of many writers and other artists. A number of well-known horror and fantasy writers, including Stephen King, Ramsey Campbell, and Neil Gaiman, cite Lovecraft as one of their primary inspirations, and have written Cthulhu Mythos stories.
Anthologies of new Cthulhu fiction continue to be popular, with the Black Wing series edited by S.T. Joshi and the Innsmouth anthologies edited by Stephen Jones, showcasing the work of a number of contemporary writers who continue to explore the mythology.
Lovecraft's influence even extends to the creators of Japanese manga and anime, such as Junji Ito, Hideyuki Kikuchi, and Kiyaki J. Kanaka. Various science fiction works have also drawn inspiration from Lovecraft's alien monsters, and the less that is said here about the tentacle fetishes that have grown out of Cthulhu obsessions, the better. There was a rock band called H.P. Lovecraft in the 60s and 70s that wrote songs inspired by his works. The owners of their record company even got permission from Lovecraft law guardian August Derleth to use the name for their band. Metallica also released a song called Call of Cthulhu, and various other songs that reference his works. In some ways, the horror of Lovecraft's work has become diluted by its popularity. Cuddly Cthulhu toys, t-shirts, and other memorabilia are available everywhere. The children's book, Where's My Shoggoth by Ian Thomas, is also an interesting take that keeps the weird but dials down the fear. Finally, Lovecraft has inspired many games in the years since his death, despite loathing games while he was alive. Many tabletop games are based on or influenced by his works. For example, the legendary Dungeons & Dragons used his works as inspiration for the infamous Mind Flayers and the Far Realm, and the Great Old Ones are explicitly lifted from his work.
A board game based on the Call of Cthulhu with the same name was released in 1981 and is in its 7th edition. The Shadow over Innsmouth inspired the video game Resident Evil 4, and many other video games owe his imagination a debt, including World of Warcraft, Call of Duty, The Elder Scrolls, Bloodborne, Fallout, RuneScape, Smite, The Witcher, XCOM, and Hearthstone.
A reader unfamiliar with Lovecraft would do well to pick up some of his better-known stories. In his time, his tales opened the eyes of readers to otherworldly horrors, the like of which they'd never imagined. Today, reading his work is a remarkable exercise in a kind of cultural anthropology. In them, we see the seeds of so many stories, games, and movies we love.
Review: Dragonslayer.
Epic fantasy is an interesting genre. The traditional blend of a medieval setting with fantastical elements, like magic and dragons, is a popular pathway for writers looking to pen an exciting story and find an audience. Duncan M. Hamilton's Dragonslayer has a lot of the qualities readers of this type of fiction will like. At its heart, the book is a straightforward quest with our hero, Guillaume del Villarreveil, or Gil, down on his luck and deep in his cups when we meet him. The stirrings of an old dragon, Alpharats, who has been disturbed from sleep by the Prince Bishop's mages, provide Gil with an opportunity to restore his reputation. He is tasked by the Prince Bishop to slay the dragon and, despite being aware of the dangers and politics swirling around him, agrees and sets off to complete the task. Hamilton's story is set in a late medieval or early Renaissance period, with some blurring between the two to accommodate the specific innovations and technology of the world. Armour is ornate, dueling blades are thin, but there are no cannons or gunpowder weapons. There is a sense of Dumas to the imagery, but no muskets to make our musketeers. The story is a little ponderous at times, as the use of different perspectives gives the reader information that the characters don't have. Gil is slow to recognize that a dragon is threatening the kingdom of Mirabaya. The history of the Chevalier is unpacked in a piecemeal way, with different characters learning different things, which means there's a fair bit of repetition for the reader. Similarly, there is a modern take to the detail which at times confuses the scenes. Full-cooked breakfasts and casual brewing of coffee, amongst other things, feel like lazy writing. When Hamilton gets into detail in his descriptive writing, the sense of period disappears. Instead, we have some kind of cherry-picked reality in which the reader is not expected to dwell on the detail, as the writer himself hasn't considered it overmuch. A specific criticism in this regard is the novel's adversary, Alpheratz. The dragon is given the viewpoint at times, which is a nice idea. However, Hamilton's characterization of his antagonist is lacking. Alpheratz comes across as far too human, with a touch of antiquity compared to the other characters in the story. There is little sense of this being an intelligent creature with a mind that considers the world in a different way. Instead, the moral constraints of Hamilton's dragons appear to be an analogue of humans, which makes the scenes between Gil and Alpheratz something of an exercise in identification and empathy for the reader. Whilst humanizing a dragon character can work, there isn't enough in the persona of Alpheratz to convey the difference between them. Additionally, Hamilton uses magic in his story as a tool to solve situations in the plot. This can be a way to incorporate it into different scenes, but when done too much it becomes repetitive and an obvious deus ex machina at times. Dragonslayer is the first of a planned trilogy from Hamilton, and a continuation of the story set in his fantasy world. Readers who are keen on Fantasy Quest might find enjoyment in his work. Dragonslayer is written by Duncan M. Hamilton and published by Tor.